Good evening. Welcome to MUFON Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo, Director of MUFON Los Angeles. We've got a great presentation for you tonight. In 1967, while in command of Minuteman missiles at Malstrom Air Force Base in Montana, First Lieutenant Robert Salas experienced an unexplained shutdown of those nuclear weapons. At the same time, a UFO was hovering above the launch control facility. As a key witness to such a staggering incident, Salas's worldview was immediately changed. Since 1995, he has begun to reveal what he experienced, including the Air Force investigation and subsequent cover-up. Surprisingly, this was not the only time such a dangerous event occurred where a UFO downed nuclear weaponry. Salas will examine these events as well as their implications. Please put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to Robert Salas.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
When I first decided to go public on this, this was back in 1994. The first organization I thought of was MUFON. And you guys didn't let me down. I talked to someone I knew about MUFON, and because I wanted to get an investigator involved in this. And I did, Jim Klotz, and he's my co-author for the book I wrote on this incident called Fated Giant. It's been a great experience working with Jim Klotz, so I want to give him credit for this. I understand that we're all interested in looking for solid evidence that these things exist. We'd all love to have a drop of blood from an ET or a piece of the craft or something like that. And so far it hasn't been forthcoming, at least not publicly. But there's other ways to acquire evidence. We do it all the time. We do it every day. In trials, we use evidence that we acquire from witnesses and other sources. So really what I'd like to do tonight is present my evidence. And I believe I've got a good case. I'd like you all to be my jury. The evidence I will show you, hopefully, is documentation, witness evidence, and statements that I've achieved or retrieved from various sources. So I'm going to try to convince you, and I'm going to try to discuss the significance of the incidents. Before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about myself, only because I'm the person up here talking, and you might want to know something about me in order to judge the evidence. I did graduate from the Academy, Air Force Academy in 1964. I was assigned as a missile launch officer in 1966. Wound up at Malstrom Air Force Base, Montana. Then I spent 3 years at Malstrom Air Force Base, master's degree in aerospace engineering at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where I met my beautiful wife, who's back there selling my books. And and then I worked on the Titan III program in propulsion here in LA at Space and Missile Systems Organization. And then in 1971, I resigned from the Air Force. And then after that, I worked 24 years in aerospace. Spent a little time at Martin Marietta and Rockwell International on the space shuttle. And then I worked 22 years for Federal Aviation Administration as aircraft certification specialist in dealing in structures, large aircraft. So I'm a little bit left brain, you might say. And right now, what I'm doing is probably my most important and satisfying job, and that's teaching high school math to a lot of adolescents. Secrecy. So when this incident happened, basically I was sworn to secrecy. It was considered a classified incident. We were told not to talk to anybody about it, and being a professional and career Air Force officer, I did my best to try to forget the whole thing, because that's what we do with classified information. We try to forget it, yeah, so that we won't make the mistake of spilling the beans at some inopportune moment. So in 1994, I was in Seattle, Washington, getting my degree in education so I could become a teacher, and I picked up this book called Above Top Secret by Timothy Good. Some of you have probably read it. But in that book, I came across a passage where missiles were disabled when a UFO was sighted at Malstrom Air Force Base. And I got pretty excited about that because I hadn't spoken about it since it happened. I thought this was my incident. And by God, the Air Force has declassified it. So here it is in print. And so I got pretty excited and went home, told my wife all about it. And I had remembered the incident, the missile shutting down, but other than that, the details were pretty scarce. So it so happened that she had a friend that was a hypnotherapist, and we did a little hypnosis, and I started retrieving some of the information because, again, these memories had been pretty well put away because of this secrecy. After that, I went on the Art Bell show and talked about this again. Well, before that, let me back up a little bit. Before that, I met Jim Klotz through MUFON, and he started submitting some Freedom of Information Act requests about the shutdown of 10 missiles. Now, we didn't mention anything about UFOs in our request to the Air Force. All we said was, could you send us any unclassified information about this incident where 10 missiles shut down for no apparent reason, Echo Flight 1967, basically that was it. And lo and behold, we got a letter back from the Air Force stating that this particular incident had not been declassified, but since we requested information, they went ahead and declassified it. So, and again, we hadn't mentioned anything at all about UFOs in our request. So they started sending some documentation and declassified what I'll call the Echo Flight incident. The launch control facilities are alphabetical, and so this was Echo Flight. And at that point, I decided to see if I could locate any more witnesses. So I did go on the Art Bell show, told him about this, and lo and behold, as a result of that show, we did get some witness call-ins. And one of the most important was, well, I mentioned Ray Fowler here because Ray Fowler, and some of you have heard of Ray, I think he wrote the book called The Andreessen Affair about an abduction. But he was working for Sylvania, I believe it was, back east. And Sylvania had the contract with the Air Force on the Minuteman missile system. And Ray had heard about the Echo Flight shutdown from some source and actually gave an interview to the Christian Science Monitor. And so Ray actually got the ball rolling. He almost lost his job over this, but it was hushed up pretty quickly, and it didn't go anywhere. And this was back in about '68, I believe. But another witness that came forward as a result of the Art Bell show was Kaminsky, Robert Kaminsky, who happened to be the head of the investigation team for Boeing on this shutdown incident. And I'll go into what Kaminsky said in just a minute. So I mentioned recalling memories, and it's been a process. In fact, up until about a month ago. I had the impression, and I'll tell you why in a minute, that the Echo and the Oscar flight, which the Oscar was the flight that I was located at, incidents happened at the same time, same day. And in fact, now I don't believe they did. Now, I'll tell you why. So a little bit about the Minuteman I system, real quick. Brief system description. It's a three-stage solid propellant rocket, about 58 feet high, 6 feet diameter at the base. It's got an inertial navigation system, which means once you program and tell it where to go, it should get there. So that's briefly it. It was, I think it was 1962 was the first Minuteman I was installed, and then it was went on from there. They had Minuteman systems at Malstrom Air Force Base, at Minot Air Force Base, a base in Wyoming, and a base also in South Dakota. Missile launch personnel duties. My duty as a launch officer was, we're basically babysitters. We were out there making sure the missile was ready to launch at a moment's notice, so to speak, and then we maintained the missile or called out maintenance people to maintain it. We made sure there was security for the missile systems, and we'd be ready to launch in case we were asked to destroy the planet. The national security environment in 1967, I think this is important to recognize this. In 67, we were fully engaged in Vietnam. We were involved in the Cold War. It hadn't been that long since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so it was a tense period, 1967. And I bring this up because I was assured later on that this was not a military exercise, and it's reasonable to assume that the military would not have done this on purpose. And we'll go into that a little bit more. Malstrom Air Force Base, this is a map of the locations of many of the missiles themselves. Let's see, I've got this little thing here. Let me show I can use it. Oscar, oh, the heck with it. Oscar flight is over towards the right, and then Echo flight is right next to it. So Oscar is right in here, Echo's over in here. These larger bullets are the launch control centers. We call them LCCs, or launch control centers. And then the missiles are in a general ring around the launch control center. And each launch control center had control over about 10 missiles. The next one. This is the interior of the launch control center. This is where we pull duty, and you see a little cot there. And you see in the background, back here, is a large blast door. It's, I'd say it was at least 3 feet thick. And the intention was to, this capsule, by the way, was 60 feet underground. The intention was to have this hardened site. So in case of nuclear attack overhead, this site would survive. So we could fire our missiles back. This is a cutout of what the facility looked like, the launch control facility. See, the capsule is about 60 feet underground here. This building here houses security teams. We had security guards up here, and this was the fenced area. Oh, okay. Thanks. Yes, and this is the main gate right here, which I'll talk about, but this area was fenced, and basically it looked like a farmhouse out in a wheat field, and it was intended to not be too obvious. This is the commander's console. Hard to see on this, but you see here are banks of indicator lights, and there's 10 of them, 10 columns of lights, and we had arming switches down here. And the launch took place over here. We had to launch communications gear, and that was the commander's console. And this was the deputy console. Again, we got arming switches here, and we got comm, and basically the commander's console controlled most of the activity and what we did as far as querying the missiles. The missiles themselves were, again, and these are called launch facilities, and there was a large door up on top, which was had explosives that would blast the door open in case of a launch. It was suspended, and then we had a maintenance building over to this side. And again, this too was hard to detect in the middle of a wheat field. And of course, all these facilities had various devices, motion sensors and things like that to detect any kind of intrusions. And we had indicators in the capsule that would tell us if there were any intrusions. So again, like I said, we had security teams up there, and these security teams would go and respond to any indications we had downstairs of intrusions, and we'd have jackrabbits, and we'd have things go inside, and we'd have to send teams out there to check it out. And again, the operational crew in the capsule was a missile combat crew commander and a deputy missile combat crew commander. During this incident, I was the deputy, and my commander was Fred Mywald. Before we go into my incident, there was an incident, pretty significant one, preceding the missile shutdowns. You may have heard of this one. It was, well, maybe not this one specifically, but in the Peter Jennings UFO special, they talked about a B-52 crew observing a UFO over Minot Air Force Base and some of the sites there. This one I'm referring to here is an incident in August of 1966. And again, this is an Air Force report talking about two objects observed. They were red, greenish, yellow, and white. Objects traveled very slowly back and forth. I'm reading this to you because I don't think you can read it there. Back and forth, up and down. Radar observed it, and they tracked it on radar up to 100,000 feet. 100,000 feet and down to 4,000 feet, and then climbed out of sight. Let's see. This is a sketch. I don't know if you can see this. Yeah. This is a sketch made by an airman, Tunney. I'll read what it says underneath. When the first object was not in front of a cloud, the color of the object sequentially changed from red, white, green, although the light seemed to radiate from the backside of the object. And this is a drawing by one of the airmen that saw this object at Minot. And this is a letter that was written by a Major Shaw, and it was written to, I believe, this was to the Condon Committee, but maybe it would have been a Blue Book at the time, but let me just read a little bit of what it says. UFO climbed for an altitude after hovering for 15 minutes. South radar altitude was 100,000 feet northwest of Minot. The only disruption was a static disrupted radio contact with the crew out at Mike 6, another launch facility. But This incident was well documented at Minot, and there have been other incidents. Another incident happened in '68, and another incident again in '66 in December. And so these incidents are written up in the book I've written. And now we get into the Montana area, and this is a report from the Great Falls Tribune dated February 11th, 1967. And it talks about reports of UFOs in the area. Third report of UFO around the Chester, Montana area. And it talks about a big ball reported in the sky. And there were many such reports. This is just a sample of some of the reports that were in the Great Falls Tribune in this time period. Okay, so here's one of my my friends, Colonel Donald Crawford. He was with me on the sighting show, if any of you saw that. But he talks about, and I'll just read one paragraph here. Some weeks before March 16th, 1967, while on alert at Echo 1, I was called from one of our guarded sites. The airman on duty said he was seeing something outside the perimeter fence that he had never seen before. This object was lighted and seemed to be watching the site. It approached and retreated, and something circled the site. This conversation lasted for a long time, certainly an hour, maybe longer. The young man was clearly distressed by what he saw. When I told him to use his weapon if he entered the site, he said that he appreciated the order but didn't think it would do any good. So, but this happened in February of '67. And my experience of the events of March, and I've got a question mark here. 2 months ago I would have put March 16th, but not now. Okay. So first thing happened, I get a call early in the morning. I believe it was early, I believe it was dark, and my commander hadn't woken up from his rest period. We shared rest periods in that little cot you saw. And he says some of the guards and himself have been observing white lights just traveling around the sky in strange ways, and he couldn't explain them. They didn't seem to be aircraft, and they were acting very strangely. And I didn't think much of it, honestly, did not think much of it at the time. I was probably reading a novel or something, as I usually did, and basically told him to call me back when something more interesting happened. And then 5 minutes later, he did call back, and this time he started to scream into the telephone. He was yelling, screaming, that he was seeing a glowing red object hovering outside the front gate. And he wanted me to tell him what to do. I told him to make sure he had all the guards out there, their weapons drawn, and make sure the perimeter fence was secured, basically. I didn't know what else to tell him. And, but I could tell he was frightened. He was extremely agitated. Then he said he had to hang up. He hung up the phone. And I went to wake up my commander, Fred Mywald. And as I was telling him about the phone calls, our missiles started shutting down. And when they shut down, we get large klaxons, horns going off, and we get a lot of lights coming up on that display panel. So bing, 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 one at a time. Initially I recalled that all 10 of my missiles shut down. Fred Mywald had a different recollection. He thought it was more like 8. But they certainly, most of them shut down. Missiles went into what's called a no-go condition, and what we do when anything like that happened, by the way, nothing like that ever did happen, except that one night. I was there for 3 years. We would lose a missile at times for various reasons. but never more than one. These missiles are independent. They have independent power systems, they have independent generators, and they're not interconnected such that they would all shut down at the same time. So the missiles went no-go, meaning they could not be launched. We immediately queried, we have a query system where it told us essentially what the problem was. It was had to do with guidance and control system failure. We reported at command post, and at this point I recall vividly, and I want to emphasize that, I recall vividly my commander turning around and saying the same thing happened at another flight, and I believe he said Echo flight. But that was a clear recollection. So that is the reason when we wrote this book that I thought that the Echo flight and the Oscar flight both went down the same morning. But I'll tell you why I've changed my mind about that. So the next thing that happened is I get back on the horn and talk to my flight security controller, the main guard upstairs, and ask him about what the situation is up there, because at this point we don't know if we're under an attack or not. Again, this is 1967, and we certainly could have been under attack, I suppose. So, but he said that everything was all clear, that the object, whatever it was, had flown off. And everything was okay. So we waited for our replacements to come that morning, and then I went up there and confronted the security flight controller, the guard, and made sure that there was no hanky-panky, that he was telling the truth, and he certainly assured me that he was, and I did believe him. He was a pretty sharp troop. At any rate, I did believe he was telling the truth. And you must understand that there's no way they could have controlled our missiles from upstairs. They had no ability to do anything that would have affected the status of the missiles. So we get back to the, I didn't get a chance to talk to the guard at length. We had a helicopter waiting for us because they wanted us to report back immediately and debrief the squadron commander. So we get back in there, into the squadron commander's office, and a representative from Air Force Office of Special Investigation was there. And the commander was an old World War II vet, highly respected, highly decorated. And I walk in there and he's white as a sheet. And the first thing I said to him was, "What the heck happened? What was going on here?" And because I thought, was this, the back of my mind, was this some kind of an exercise? And he assured me that he had no idea what was happening, and he was completely flabbergasted. And at that point, they did ask us to sign an oath, security oath, which we both did. And we were told not to speak to anybody about this. Again, the same thing happened at Echo Flight, was what I recall vividly from either my commander or some other source. They're back at the base. There was, I remember, discussion back to the base about UFO sightings, but after I talked to the squadron commander, that nobody was to talk about that. I was able to locate Fred Mywald, who was my commander in the capsule, and he retired as a full colonel. He was actually, a little bit about Fred, he was actually a base commander of Offutt Air Force Base, which was SAC headquarters at the time. Later on, not during this incident, but later on, he reached the rank of full colonel. And he wrote me this a letter about this incident, and I've spoken to him many times. He's still alive and well and living in Las Vegas. We were at Oscar Flight when we lost 8 missiles in rapid succession. Topside security notified us the mobile team had reported observing the UFO while responding, obviously at your direction, to a situation at an outlying launch facility. While en route back to the LCF, radio contact was lost and remained out until the security vehicle approached the LCF as launch control facility. 2 very upset young men wasted no time in getting back inside. I heard secondhand that one was released from security team duties. And I've heard this from other sources that those guards and maintenance people that have seen these things have been shaken, very shaken by what they've seen. And here's a statement of Walt Fiegel, again, a lieutenant colonel retired, and he was the deputy at Echo Flight. And at Echo Flight, all 10 missiles went down, and that's what we've got documentation backing that up. And what he says here is when the first one went down and I talked to security out there, they reported this UFO hovering over the site. I said, yeah, right. What are you guys drinking out there? We struck, which means they sent strike teams to both of the sites that had been occupied. I told them to get within a mile of the site and report in. They both reported that they and 2 maintenance crews and 2 security troops on the site all reported UFOs overhead. And right after that, Echo Flight lost all 10 of their missiles. And this was on the 16th of March, 1967. This is a telex we got as part of our Freedom of Information Act request. This is dated March 17th. I know you can't read it, but I'll read parts of it for you here. One part I want to read is they reference my secret message dated 17 March, which was at a previous time period, same subject. We were never able to retrieve this message, much as we've tried, but I'll mention that again in a minute. All 10 missiles at Echo Flight at Malstrom lost strategic alert within 10 seconds of each other. This incident occurred on 16 March. All missiles have been returned to strategic alert. The fact that no apparent reason for the loss of 10 missiles can be readily identified as cause for grave concern to this headquarters. And then he goes on. This is SAC headquarters talking to their support base in Utah. And he goes on to say that we've got to get an investigation going and get to the bottom of this. This is a letter I received. Another witness that came forward is another Lieutenant Colonel Dwayne Arneson. And he was a crypto officer, cryptographic officer, top secret control officer in March of 1967. And he was in the center. He says, I can distinctly recall reading a message that came through my communications center concerning a UFO that was seen hovering near a missile silo that was observed by missile personnel on duty. I do not recall the exact date, nor to whom the message was sent, but he certainly recalls the message. He says, the message concerning the UFO was so unique that it clearly registered with me. So that message, I believe, is the one that was referenced in the previous telex, and one we haven't been able to get a hold of. We've really tried. This is a copy of the what's called the Unit History Report. These were quarterly reports that were written by the wing at Malstrom to SAC headquarters about the goings-on at the base. And in this one, dated for 1 January through 31 March 67, I just want to read you one part of this page. This document does talk about the Echo Flight incident, and then it goes on to say rumors of unidentified flying objects around the area Echo Flight during the time of the fault were disproven. I don't know how you disprove a rumor unless those that were spreading the rumor recanted, and none of the guys that I had talked to ever recanted to me. At any rate, that's what it says in there. And the author of this report is a man by the name of David Gamble. He was an airman and had to issue these reports. And so I contacted David Gamble, the wing historian for the 341st Strategic Missile Wing, and he's the one that put together these reports. And I asked him about the Echo flight incident, and he said, I don't specifically recall the foundation for the report in the history. And on page 38, that stated the rumors of UFO were disproven. This section of the history includes the responsive mobile strike team. This information was obtained from a footnoted report by engineering investigation. What I do recall is that there was a general unwillingness to discuss the subject by anyone I contacted. There were 2 times that I recall where sections of the history were scrutinized and changes were made beyond editorial. These were the UFO sightings history, and he says UFO sightings history, so there must have been more than one, and reported morale problems in the fighter interceptor group. Okay, this is a statement of Robert Kaminsky, and he's, again, one of the witnesses that came forward as a result of the Art Bell show. He was head of the, he was project engineer for the Boeing investigation team. This was the team that went out. Boeing was a prime contractor on the Minuteman missile. Excuse me. As the internal Boeing project engineer, I arranged meetings necessary with management and technical personnel required to determine a course of action to be taken in exploring why 10 missiles had suddenly fallen from alert status with no explanation for it. The team met with me to report their findings, and it was decided that the final report would have nothing significant in it to explain what happened at Echo Flight. The team went off to do the report. Meanwhile, I was contacted by a representative and told him that the incident was reported as being a UFO event. So subsequently, we were notified a few days later to stop any further effort on this project. We were not to submit a final engineering report. This was most unusual since all of our work required review by our customer, the Air Force. A little bit more about the investigation. They looked at power failures, potential power failures, and they looked at the possibility of the crew programming computers down in the capsule. They looked at equipment failures. They looked at everything they possibly could, lightning strikes, things like that, and they were very thorough and could not find any valid or viable reasons why these missiles shut down. This is a statement of Robert Jameson. He was a lieutenant. He was a targeting officer in 1967 at Malstrom. He says, I received a call from Job Control. They are the unit that keeps track of the missile status. I was told the missile at Oscar Flight had gone off alert and required to restart. No other information was given, which was not unusual. I called my team members. Upon arriving at the hangar, prepare for dispatch, a friend approached me and asked me if I knew what was happening. I did not. I was told a UFO was seen over Oscar Flight, and the whole flight went off alert. I then went to Job Control, found out what was going on. They confirmed that was true, and I was to go out and restart the missiles. I mentioned that I thought this was unusual or something to that effect. They told me something even more unusual. A truck driver reported a UFO going into a canyon south of Great Falls at this location near the town Belt. Now, the Belt incident, which I'll talk about in a minute, is very well documented. But it turns out it happened on March 24th, not March 16th. So this is where I'm a little iffy about the time of of my incident, my particular incident at Oscar Flight, because here we've got a witness saying that it happened around the same time as this belt sighting. And that happened on March 24th between the hours of 2100 and 0400. Numerous reports were received by Malstrom Air Force Base agencies of UFO sightings in the Great Falls, Montana area. Reports of UFO landing near Bell, Montana were received from several sources, including deputies of Cascade County Sheriff's Office. And this is written by Lieutenant Colonel Chase, who had the title of, you guessed, UFO officer for Malmstrom Air Force Base. That was actually his title. This is an official Air Force telex. Again, we were able to retrieve. Two more recent witness accounts. On the day of the belt sighting, I was on alert duty as a missile targeting officer. I was sent out to Oscar Flight that day to retarget missiles that had been shut down for unknown causes. Here's another one I was stationed at. This is a friend of Walt Fiegel's, who is, I'm quoting here, Walt Fiegel was the deputy at Echo Flight. I was stationed at Space and Missile Systems Organization until 1972. During my tour there and up until I left, I knew of Air Force personnel who were working on trying to discover the cause of the Echo Flight shutdowns. They told me that no known cause was ever determined. So this is 1972. They're still trying to figure out what happened at Echo. This is brand new information. I'm revealing it here for the first time, and it's from Mr. X. I cannot reveal his name. What I can tell you, he is a very, very reliable witness, but not yet ready to go public. But he told me, and I've confirmed, a very interesting story. He was head of the targeting team for Echo 7. I was one of the Echo missiles that went down. And he was involved in what's called a startup procedure. He was out there, they had done some maintenance on the missile, and he was going through startup. And he and his assistants were down in the tube where the missile, down at the base of the missile. And they go down there on a ladder, and next thing he knows, he's hearing this ladder shake, or tapping on the ladder, and one of the guard upstairs yells down to him that he should come up. And so he goes up to the top of the ladder and looks out and sees this, what he described as a bright orange ball hovering nearby. So this was a very close-in sighting of this object. Strangely enough, he told me that he was not particularly agitated by this. He was curious about it, but he had a job to do, and he was going to get this missile back up and operating. So he went down, back down, and told the guard to report it to the command post, but he was going to go back and get this missile restarted. So he'd go through this startup procedure, and it would mysteriously stop in the middle of the startup procedure. This object was still overhead. Actually, if you look at the cover of my book, it depicts this situation. This object was still over the head, above him. He was down at the base of the tube of the missile, working, and this object disrupted the startup procedure each time he'd get to a certain point. And why does he know it was the object? Well, he told me the object knew exactly what he was going to do and when he was going to do it, and basically wanted to send a message. But how did he know it was the object? He could actually feel it. He could actually feel the energy going through his body and impacting what he was doing in the start procedure. So I can't wait for him to come forward. He promised me that he would at some point, but as of this point, because of personal reasons, he can't come forward publicly. This is further documentation. This was written to Dr. Condon by I believe it was, well, it was from Malstrom, but it does talk about the belt sighting. Truck driver Ken Williams, he was driving a truck from Laurel, Montana towards Great Falls on Highway 87, and he saw this huge dome-shaped object emitting an intense bright light, and it landed in a ravine approximately 1.5 miles south of the highway. Mr. Williams parked his truck and approached the object. As he approached the object, lifted off the ground only to settle back in the ravine and then by the highway. So he flagged down a motorist. This truck driver flagged down a motorist, asked him to call the highway patrol. They did dispatch a highway patrolman, Mr. Bud Nader. Nader reported that upon reaching the scene, he observed the unusual light emanating from the area that the truck driver had talked about. So this object was witnessed by not only the truck driver, but highway patrolman. Air Force, what does Air Force have to say about this? This is the official Air Force position, excuse me, as of 94, I believe, was the last time we tried to get the Air Force to comment on any of this. And they sent us this fact sheet, and I'll just read you part of it. And this is an official Air Force fact sheet. It says, the decision to discontinue UFO investigations was based on a number of factors, including reports, blah, 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 the Connick Committee, and it says, as a result of these investigations and experiences, the conclusions of Project Blue Book were no UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force has ever given any indication of a threat to our national security. Now, I just told you we've lost nearly 20 nuclear missiles in 1967 while UFOs were overhead at the height of the Cold War. And if that was not a national security incident, I don't know what was. So, conclusions, I'll wrap it up here. No valid cause for shutdowns was ever determined. Extensive investigation is proof that this was not an Air Force exercise. Like I said, this was investigated up through 1972. We have shown through eyewitness accounts and documents that intelligently controlled objects of unknown origins demonstrated control over our most advanced weapons at the time. Their purpose open to speculation. The Air Force or higher has and is hiding facts of this and other cases. I mentioned I was recently at my Air Force Academy class reunion, and one of my classmates was head of a black ops program as a civilian, and he was told that he had to report to Congress because their oversight committee wanted to know about this project. And basically he was bragging to us that he was able to pull the wool over their eyes and give them a lot of useless information about this project. This was one of the secret aircraft that you've probably heard about by now. It's no longer secret, but he indicated that it was very easy to pull the wool over these congressmen's eyes on the status of this project. I just mentioned that because it's pretty clear that our government has very little oversight over black ops projects, and so whoever is controlling these projects has pretty much free rein. I believe the public has a right to know about the facts and implications of these incidents. Significance? Well, this is my own impression, and it's just my own opinion that the ET wanted to send us a message about nuclear weapons. The message, and we heard this message back in, I don't know how many of you saw The Day the Earth Stood Still, but we heard this same message there. Humankind and Earth is headed for annihilation unless we collectively disarm our nuclear weapons. Clearly, we're not succeeding, if you read the paper. That's about it. Thank you for your attention.